I'll start off with some really quick introductions from all of our presenters. So I'll get started off, and everyone else feel free to chime in any order. But my name is Darius Green. I'm an adjunct professor in the counseling department, Department of Graduate Psychology at James Madison University, and I also work full-time here in another department as well. So that's a little bit about me without getting into too much detail.
Hi, I'm Jean. I am a doctoral candidate at Ohio University. And I'm excited to see all of you. This is fun.
I'm not sure if Chantrelle is back yet, but I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Brittany Williams. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and I am an assistant professor at the School of Education at Syracuse University in the Counseling and Human Services Department. I'm excited to be here and I welcome you all. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Greetings, everyone. I am Dr. Chantrelle Varnado-Johnson. I am an assistant professor at Nicholls State University, and I'm also the school counseling program coordinator. And it is a pleasure seeing y'all this evening for this presentation.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We're going to walk through our PowerPoint this evening. And Dr. Williams, I believe you're going to take us away to get started.
Yes. So as I said, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Our hope for this evening is that you will leave with some learning outcomes, the ability to describe the phenomenon of cyber hate with this specific focus on cyber racism, be able to analyze the potential impact of cyber hate, as well as the core findings from our study on cyber racism and counseling cyberspaces, and be able to identify action steps for counselor educators to address cyber hate. So we are presenting this webinar with hopes that you will have some key takeaways from our study, as well as an understanding that there was this increased reliance on digital technology in counseling following COVID-19. And so there were these aspects of social and racial unrest as a result of like the mass violence that was happening toward Black and Brown folks and others with marginalized identities, such as trans lives. And we acknowledge that most of these concerns went unaddressed in specific cyberspaces, for example, CSJ. So Dr. Green is going to provide the overview of cyber hate for us.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, for that really quick intro. As mentioned, I just kind of want to clarify, sometimes when racism is being specifically focused on, there's this tension that's felt like, what about other forms of identity? I just kind of want to acknowledge that we kind of addressed and came into this topic with a focus on racism because it was one phenomenon that was specifically noticed among many of us, and we're not focusing on racism to ignore other forms of discrimination and prejudice. In fact, I'll try to certainly include them here and invite co-presenters to chime in as well. My underlying logic here is that even though a specific focus on racism will hopefully provide really some common understanding that could be applied to other issues of discrimination and prejudice. And I also want to acknowledge that by focusing, let's say, on transphobia that takes place on the internet, that can come with its own specific nuances that will differ from racism. I guess I want to encourage others who may want to know more about other identities and how they are affected in online cyberspaces. I encourage you to sort of collaborate in doing those kind of investigations and sharing of resources. But I want to give a really quick overview of cyber hate. we can broadly define cyber hate as the use of any sort of digital technology or electronic communication in ways that express discriminatory or denigrating messages to marginalized groups. And so it's pretty much the same as offline or in-person sort of discrimination or prejudice or oppression, just communicated through digital technology. So one way to understand, or maybe an entry point that many of us can probably grasp onto, is starting off with a belief system that underlies cyber hate. Regardless of the nature of the belief system, there's this underlying belief of the superiority of one social or group identity over others, and that superiority and sort of subsequent inferiority is sort of inherent. People, in the case of racism, white individuals don't do anything to earn that superiority. It's just sort of granted to members of that group. Simultaneously, if I'm looking at gender, individuals who are trans, non-binary, gender expansive, they do not do anything to earn that belief of inferiority that some individuals hold towards individuals who might be trans. It's just simply a matter of their identity in that group, particularly for perpetrators. And so some examples of those belief systems, anti-Blackness, if we want to classify a specific form and manifestation of racism. Xenophobia is something that has been noted in some literature, particularly with the scapegoating that happens, particularly in the United States, the scapegoating of people from China, which gets generalized to this anti-Asian sentiment. And also transphobia as well, these sort of prejudice and discrimination towards those who are either one, transgender, or exist and identify outside of the quote unquote traditional gender binary. Just like offline discrimination and prejudice, cyber hate can be either overt or covert. And I think with both of these terms, I want to emphasize that the perspective that we're taking is focusing on those who are targeted with such experiences, whether that targeting is intentional or not intentional. And so typically what's overt or considered overt are things that are going to be easily identifiable by that person who is targeted, or whether they are directly targeted or if they simply read comments that are targeting towards others like them. And so some common examples, they are not unique to online contexts, but the use of slurs, whether they be racial slurs or transphobic slurs, homophobic slurs, so on and so forth. Other sort of offensive comments that are specifically directed towards members of that marginalized group as well would be examples of overt or blatant discrimination. One thing that's interesting to note, I think if you happen to read any literature on any form of discrimination or prejudice, it's often noted that in today's age, there is a decrease in overt discrimination, and what is more commonly seen is covert racism. In online context and in cyberspaces, that may not necessarily be the case. In fact, cyberspaces may be sort of a retreat for individuals who want to express these views and beliefs and to cause harm or to recruit others like them to sort of collaborate in enacting their discriminatory and prejudiced belief systems. So I just want to clarify that there might be a higher prevalence in certain cyberspaces, particularly those outside of a professional context. On the other hand, covert, from the perspective of a target, this might be something that is more subtle, less noticeable. It might be something that leaves someone wondering what just happened. There might be some ambivalence about what someone meant or if they meant it or not. And so some examples could be any form of microaggression or these daily slights towards someone's identity. Oftentimes, this kind of mixes well with stereotypes, placing members in certain boxes. A personal experience in my local community, I was supporting a candidate for a local elected school board position, and there were several individuals who were rallying around to support this candidate. This candidate was a white woman who, in her racial identity, found it important to bring an anti-racist platform to a school board position. Two individuals who vocally supported this candidate on social media were Black women, and something that I commonly noticed that is an example of a microaggression and stereotyping is that when these Black women chose to assert their voice and really no way that's different from any of the academic writing that we do. They were labeled as aggressive and labeled as unprofessional, things like that. That's a pretty clear example, at least from my end, reading those comments, as labeling Black women as being an angry Black woman, which could be an example of something that is considered covert discrimination. To an outside voice, they might not notice that or pay attention to it, but for people who hold that identity that's being aggressed upon, they will certainly notice and feel the impact of that. Additionally, any kind of implicit bias that's embedded in the underlying belief systems that maybe aren't explicitly being said, but are very noticeable and fit one microaggressions and common stereotypes. These are all examples of covert racism. It's not covert racism, covert discrimination. Again, it's not unique to the online context, but again, it can happen in the online context. And sort of to briefly highlight some characteristics of cyber hate and mostly the cyber piece that gives it sort of a different shape than what happens in an in-person or offline context. In a lot of literature, whether it be on cyberbullying or just broadly on online behavior, something that's commonly noted is that in an online context, there typically is some degree of anonymity and detachment from the social connectedness with others that is not as readily seen in offline context. And as a result of that detachment, a lot of individuals tend to feel a sense of disinhibition, meaning they will behave in ways that they might not otherwise behave in an offline context. I guess this can kind of tie in with this third bullet point here of individuals might feel a greater sense of entitlement towards their quote unquote right to free speech, or in the context of academia, which might be a background that many of us are coming from or work in. Some individuals might feel an entitlement to academic freedom to say whatever they want to say without any sort of recourse or without any concern for the actual impact of those words. There's a prioritization of free speech over, and then a lack of acknowledgement of what hate speech actually is. In online context, individuals often identify maybe more strongly with their various social identities. And so someone who identifies as a white man may sort of communicate in ways in the social cyberspace that maybe exaggerate white maleness. For me as a Black man, I might interact in a cyberspace in ways that would kind of communicate and exaggerate or make overt my Black maleness. Something else about cyberspaces that is really important is the fact that, I guess this depends on the cyberspace. Email between two individuals is technically a cyberspace. But when we talk about things like Facebook or Facebook groups, Twitter, CSJ, any other professional cyberspace that we may use as professionals, whether it be any other listserv associated with a university, an organization, ACA Connect, they provide a really large audience, which can be really useful for sharing resources and like the professional collaborations that these spaces are created for. At the same time, for people who are looking to perpetrate and looking to cause harm or spread their ideas and assimilate others towards those ideas, that provides a lot of targets to sort of hone in on, even if it's only like one or two people. A broad message I'm thinking about CSJ being one common environment that many of us use. If I were to post or interact with someone, there are up to 5,000 to 6,000 individuals who can possibly receive that message. Something else that's important to keep in mind with cyberspaces is that there's a permanence to the material, unlike things that happen offline. If someone yells at a transphobic slur or says something really insensitive, that is only going to exist for the time that it occurs in person. The impact of it might definitely persist longer. But in online contexts, if there's an email that's posted, I'm thinking about an email listserv that is going out to several people, so it can exist within each person's email for however long they have that email. The potential to screenshot things that are online can, again, increase that permanence. And so it can be really hard to erase or get rid of certain content. And in terms of the impact, someone can have repeat exposure from seeing such content over and over again, either on accident or by their own choice. Cyberspaces also, just like in person, allow for multiple channels of communication. Things can be communicated by text, by sharing links to videos, through audio, and that can provide much more opportunities for individuals to share prejudiced beliefs. And lastly, something else that's commonly known is that long distance relationships are possible in cyberspace. And so someone in California can collaborate with someone who maybe is in Canada or Maine or across the country. And otherwise, in the offline context, they would not have the ability to easily connect, particularly in real time. But that's a possibility through any form of cyberspace that allows real-time connection. And so very briefly, how it occurs, how cyber hate occurs, there are a couple different things that we can pay attention to sort of detect when it is occurring. First and foremost is the act of cyberbullying, any sort of aggressive behavior in a cyberspace towards either individuals or individuals in certain groups. And so in terms of the discrimination and prejudice aspect, this cyberbullying might be directed towards members of specific groups, and members of other groups, particularly those who hold some degree of privilege, might typically systematically be ignored in terms of that cyberbullying. And cyberbullying is something that overlaps with cyber hate, but it also exists separately. These next two bullet points are very specific to cyber hate. And so again, from that target perspective, someone can tell if they are being targeted if they are, one, directly targeted. And so if someone directly engages in some kind of aggressive behavior towards someone because of their identity, that would be an example of a direct experience. Additionally, there's a huge possibility of having vicarious experiences. Again, with a large audience, one single interaction between two people, or just one single interaction, can be witnessed by a very large audience. And that interaction can have a negative effect on that large audience and also the group context. So in terms of the impact of cyber racism, I'm not going to go into all of these studies. If you're familiar, these studies mostly focus on racism, and I assume that they may also apply and correlate to cyber hate in general. I'm not going to go into all these in general, all these studies specifically, but I will say that if you are familiar with any literature on the impact of discrimination or minority stress or just trauma theory, none of these results or empirical evidence that exists is sort of new or shocking. But I also want to turn it over to Chantrelle to talk a little bit about racial battle fatigue, and Dr. Williams, if you have anything to chime in as well, feel free to share.
Sure, thank you very much, Dr. Green. So I'm gonna start off with this. In the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, I'm sick and tired of being tired. This civil rights activist said in 1964, she was fighting for our rights that was supposed to be guaranteed by our First Amendment protections of freedom of speech. Yet in 2021, the constant exposure to cyber hate exhausts people of color, more importantly, to other folks. And what we find is we're in a society where the racism, the xenophobia, and the transphobia is communicated at heightened speeds. And so when we're talking about racial battle fatigue, that's referring to the psychological symptoms from high blood pressure to anxiety, frustration, shock, and an experience by people of color who are navigating white spaces. And so this is that physical and psychological toll taken due to constant and unceasing discrimination experienced on the World Wide Web, the microaggressions that may take place in chat rooms, or even stereotype threats. And so when we think about if you're working in academia, or even if you're working in a professional school counseling setting, or even in an agency setting, experiencing that chronic exposure to discrimination and microaggressions, that can result in forms of generalized anxiety manifested by physical and emotional symptoms. So when we think about the racial battle fatigue, we're going beyond William A. Smith's idea and extending it to think about the academy, or how even higher education operates, or how reading the messages on platforms such as CESNet may result in individuals having an unimaginable workspace because the documentation may live longer. And so when we think about these microaggressions, the stereotype threat, the underfunding, defunding of initiatives, expansive commitments to diversity related strategic plans with restrictive power and action, and even thinking about the departmental climates of exclusivity and inequity, or even our diverse workers, or even with our allies, we might find ourselves in a bad land where our identity difference might be used to promote institutional values, while at the same time creating unimaginable spaces for us to be able to flourish and thrive. So when we think about cyber hate and cyberbullying, although they may be use similar means, we think about the crucial differences that goes beyond the prejudice, the intolerance, and the online violence. So when you're thinking about how cyber hate targets more communities than individuals, those individuals are experiencing racial microaggressions in both work and social spaces that have tangible consequences. And what we know is through empirical research that racism, when it's experienced as a stressor, that has a negative influence on mental, emotional, and physical health of people of color, especially Black Americans. So in fact, African Americans have been found to experience a heightened level of racism compared to other people of color. And that was found in Pitarsi, Todd, Neville's, and Carter study back in 2012. And what else we think about is how stresses of racism are proven to impact life satisfaction, self-esteem, and health. And so due to that constant perpetuation of superiority in the US culture, there can be some psychological consequences where individuals may feel devalued from what they're reading on the web, as far as conflicting cultural norms that can lead to a lesser perception of self. And that can result in internalized racism. And we also look at the similarities between the psychological responses of the racism to trauma symptoms, such as that physical pain, that impersonal sensitivity, and the anxiety. So you have to also think about that interconnectedness of the physical, the mental, and the emotional. So when you think about that, cyberbullying cannot be considered systematically as cyber hate. And so when you think about cyber hate, it targets your identity and the community to which you belong. And it can be occasional and it can be triggered by events. So that's what we have to think about, how those hateful online forms of expression, text, images, videos, pictures, graphic representations, whose objective is to belittle, humiliate, or ridicule a person or a group of persons, can have everlasting deterioration on BIPOC folks. And so we have to think about how we can use holistic interventions when discussing the prevalence of anti-Black violence and the impact racism has had on the mental health of BIPOC folks.
Thank you for adding that bit. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, particularly as it relates to some of the data that we're going to very briefly look at. But I also just want to check in, Jean and Dr. Williams, if you have anything you want to add before we move on related to cyber hate or its impact. Right, I cannot see you all, so sorry. Feel free to chime in at any point though. And so I'm just going to very briefly review a study that we've done specifically on cyber racism. I'm not going to go into this into a ton of detail just for the sake of time, because I definitely would like to offer time for others to chime in, ask questions and whatnot, but I will try to hit on some key highlights. I also want to make a distinction. Some of the data that we're going to share, or they're going to share here, is from a broader sample than what was shared on CSNet, or that CSNet specific report that was shared if you are coming here from CSNet. The results are fairly the same, but there are some broad differences. And so I just want to throw that out there. Also, this data is kind of under peer review at the moment. So some things that I might be presenting could change depending on feedback and if and hopefully when that paper would be accepted. So our investigation looked at mostly two broad questions. One, what is the prevalence and impact of cyber racism? And two, what's the relationship that colorblindness, and I kind of share that term a bit lightly for two reasons. One, I feel like there's a concern with disability, with colorblindness being an actual disability, and holding racist attitudes or choosing to not see race. One also may not be necessarily a benign choice or born out of ignorance. Personally, that's my thought that I'll add there. But those are kind of the broad things that we were trying to study. And we looked at a couple of different listservs and cyberspaces in the counseling profession that seemed like they were commonly used, such as ACA Connect, AMCD, African American Concerns, the American College Counselors Association's listserv, CSNet, the Ohio Counselor Association listserv. And as a result of that, we received about 124 participants, and the majority of those came from CSNet. So this data is very much biased towards what happened on CSNet, or happened on CSNet within a 12-month prevalence. I'm going to skip over this slide since the next two slides have some pictorial representation. In terms of that prevalence, on the left side of this screen is depicting reported direct experiences with cyber hate more broadly. And as we can see, there is very few people reported directly experiencing cyber hate of any form. However, on the right side of the screen, there's a much greater prevalence of that vicarious exposure. And part of that is due to just the nature of cyberspaces. If, again, one single interaction can be observed by multiple other people. A couple things to note. Some of the most rated or indicated direct exposures would be, looks like around age, race, and spirituality. But around vicarious exposure, there seems to be a much more larger difference between what was witnessed or reported to be witnessed, with race being the most witnessed, along with gender, religion, spirituality, sexual orientation as well. When looking at the specific perceived targets of cyber racism, one thing that this graph clearly shows is that Black and African American people were perceived to be targets the most, along with those who are Asian, bicultural, and biracial and multiracial, Latinx. And there seemed to be a smaller prevalence of perceiving Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, Native and Indigenous Americans, white, and other sort of social races. In terms of the impact, first we did like a comparison of those who identified as white and those who we lumped together as BIPOC. One little note there is that not everyone in that category of BIPOC sort of thinks the same. There is racial identity development, which is really important to keep in mind. That's not something that we studied here, but there were no race differences across the measures of impact. Particularly, we were specifically looking at positive and negative emotions and sense of belonging and inclusion. We did observe that there was a significant difference in the perception of the frequency of vicarious exposure to cyber racism, where those in the BIPOC group reported greater frequency of that cyber racism exposure. And that was done within one-way ANOVA analysis. The rest of the stats that I'm going to very briefly touch on were done with a multiple regression analysis, in which cyber racism, which includes one, cyberbullying, direct exposure to cyber racism, and vicarious exposure. Those were predictors of positive and negative emotions, and then I'll get to inclusion on the next slide. Regarding positive emotions, none of the variables significantly predicted, had any significant predictive, they did not significantly predict positive emotions. With negative emotions, that was significantly predicted by vicarious exposure in such a way that increased frequency of exposure was linked with greater negative emotions. Regarding belonging and authenticity, one thing that was a little bit different about this analysis is that we moved positive and negative emotions to the predictors of belonging and authenticity. And so some things that we noticed were, again, each of these variables listed here were significant predictors where both vicarious exposure and negative emotions were significantly predicted lower ratings of belonging, whereas positive emotions predicted greater ratings of belonging. And the same trend was noticed with authenticity. In terms of colorblindness, we use bivariate correlation using Spearman-Rowe. Two, I guess, sets of analyses that we looked at. We looked at the relationship between whether someone indicated they had directly experienced cyber racism and their colorblind attitudes, and also the relationship between whether they indicated having direct vicarious exposure. So interestingly, for those who indicated that they had direct exposure, that had a positive relationship with colorblind attitudes, or said another way, there was a greater likelihood that those who indicated that they had directly experienced cyber racism, that was positively correlated and related to having less awareness about racism. A converse relationship was found with vicarious exposure, where those who indicated that they had vicarious exposure had a greater awareness of racism, to sort of phrase that in a succinct way. And sort of to make sense of that, or make more sense of the relationship that colorblind attitudes had, when looking at the targets that individuals identified for cyber racism, for those who identified white people as targets, that had a positive relationship with colorblind attitudes, or said another way, people who had less reported awareness of, or lower awareness of racism, identified white people as targets more often, and the opposite relationship was found for those who identified Black, Asian, biracial, and multiracial, and Latinx people as targets. So some really quick takeaways: cyber racism and other forms of cyber hate were observed, particularly in the CSNET listserv. The frequency of experiencing cyber racism seemed to have a possible impact or relationship with emotional experiences and sense of inclusion. And regarding colorblindness, colorblind attitudes may contribute to the degree to which how individuals perceive a cyber racism, particularly themselves as targets. And so I want to just sort of wrap that up there and turn over towards some implications. So Jean, feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Darius. So implications. CSNET is a public forum. It is something that anyone can go online and read if they want to, and it is archived. There are records going back many years. So from that, it seems very likely that if people are saying things that indicate prejudice, bias, racism, what have you, it is going to be going on in classrooms as well, whether that is overt or covert. There's also the possibility that maybe those conversations aren't happening in classrooms, but counseling students see it happening on CSNET, and then they have classes with those people, or these are their colleagues that they're going to see at conferences. And this creates a lot of additional anxiety in those places where we don't need to have it. There's also evidence that we are currently in the process of figuring out how to explore that this happens for other minoritized groups. I think a lot of people have noted the transphobia today, which I super appreciate because it is Trans Awareness Week. Congratulations, you know now. So let me go on to the next slide. So there are actions that we can take that can prevent this from happening. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be a universal answer, but there are steps that can be taken towards progress. Like I say to all of my clients, better is better. So part of this is going to be developing a better understanding of how bigotry and the digital world interact, and how it can amplify that in different ways. There are also good things that come from it, right? So like we can collaborate with people in very different places, and that can lead to really good outcomes. But there are also ways that it has its disadvantages. Part of doing this work is bringing it into our classrooms. So doing coursework around anti-racism, giving people more resources on working with minoritized groups, understanding how the stresses of being part of a marginalized group in America impacts people's well-being, both in a classroom and in counseling and in the world generally. We are behind on integrating cyberspaces into our work as counselors and counselor educators. We even see it in like the ethical codes. We haven't addressed everything that needs to be addressed, even now that we are depending so much on telehealth. And it's because this evolves so quickly. I think part of making sure that we stay on top of this is having committees specifically for cyberspaces that meet regularly and address these changes, right? I don't think anyone expected there to be controversy on TikTok about what a therapist said about their clients that were not named and what that means for people and how it made people feel, but it happened. We need to make sure that our conversations about power dynamics don't just stop in our classrooms, but also are things that we understand in cyberspaces. Because there are definitely voices that get elevated, and there are algorithms that make it so that we see the people that disagree with us more because we're more likely to engage with those people who disagree with us. But that also has this vicarious trauma and re-traumatization that we don't need. I think that we also need to make sure that these are things that are worked into, say, KCREP accreditations. We need to not only address racism, which KCREP perhaps needs some more explicit language around, but also the cyberspaces, not just the CESNet or Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is where people are and where they will be in the coming years. Making sure that there's accountability in those spaces as well. Are these committees made up of one specific homogenous group? And if they are, how do we change that? There's also bystander intervention. So actually really quickly, I skipped over a point. Misinformation is a huge problem in cyberspaces. It is also something that I think is worth addressing because we have this expectation that if we cite something, it is real and true. And in some cases that is incredibly true, but we cannot do research without bias. That is impossible. And sometimes we will find research that defends a position, but we don't analyze it critically to make sure that it is what we want it to be. So that is something that also needs to go into classrooms, because we talk about getting good sources, but we don't talk about how good sources can still be incorrect sources. So bystander intervention. Broaching. This is a concept that we have a lot of literature around in, say, supervision, but are those conversations being had in classrooms? Are we having that occur in like advisory positions, right? Is a white person who is the advisor to a counselor in training in their program going to have those conversations as well and make sure that a marginalized student gets the support they need, because they're going to experience a lot of different things than perhaps their peers might. Cultural humility, making sure that we understand that we are coming from different cultures and it's okay not to know things, but we have to continue to educate ourselves and be better. Monologue versus a dialogue. A lot of the conversations that happen on CESNet are people trying to make personal points, and they don't have any expectation of learning or changing perspective. It's just the same person saying the same thing again and again more aggressively. That doesn't help us when we're talking about these power dynamics or changing the counseling profession to be more inclusive, because one person is just talking and no one is listening. Does anybody have anything to add to that? I know I have another slide after this, but.
I'll chime in. Thank you, Jean. And what else I would just say, just to piggyback off of Jean, is as a bystander, being able to learn more about different ways to use the broaching, the cultural humility, and the dialoguing to respond with counter speech to address the cyber hate, and consider using it to confront the hate online and in coursework. Plus, incorporating anti-racism coursework into the curriculum via educating your students and your colleagues about cyber hate, and sharing information on the social media, having the individual conversations with our stakeholders, with our administrators. And also, when we see the hate speech online, reporting it so it can bring attention to our guiding and governing documents. And then lastly, use social media as a powerful platform to document incidences of brutality or other injustices that's been impacting historically minoritized folks. So in sum, being able to affirm and restore humanity by educating our counseling community and our counselors in training through the promotion of healing, empowerment, and wellness.
Thank you. So this kind of also comes back to what has already been said, but we talked about like prevention, but intervention is both the same and different, right? I think that as Dr. I'm sorry, I can't see the full thingy. I don't want to call you by your first name. That's
okay. Rude. Dr. Varnado-Johnson.
Dr. Varnado-Johnson just said, we have to do the bystander work, and that is also intervention work, right? It does require us providing education. We also need to make sure that we have accountability. As she was saying, right, are we documenting this? Are we seeing this? Are we keeping this so other people can see it? What does accountability mean in this idea of being PhDs, right? Because we have these gatekeeping tools and these remediation tools for our students, for counselors in training. But what do we have to address these disparities when the people who are in charge are doing harmful acts? We need more from counseling organizations. There's not enough of those conversations happening. I'm certain that they are happening in some of the groups that are for more minoritized groups, but I don't know that they're happening in every place. We definitely need things like these at conferences, and we need ways to make sure that someone is checking on programs. I know that we've all had issues with some of that across being in programs. And we, as kind of working on this project, have experienced a lot of interesting interactions on CESNet and other forms of media. And we noticed ourselves that when people reached out to support us, even if they weren't supporting us publicly, it made a significant difference in how we felt about what was happening. Having these community spaces, being able to have people that people can go to when they are experiencing these things, right? Part of community is sometimes suffering together, being able to prop each other up in those moments where things are difficult. Part of what we would also like to do here, I think, is a little bit of a call to action, right? We've talked about the statistics, we've talked about the damage that it does, the long-term effects that it can have on us and our bodies and our well-being. When you see these things, try to have a conversation, try to even use this, right? We put a report up online on Dr. Green's website, using this in papers or conferences or just conversations with your peers, making sure that maybe somebody here suggests that we start doing more around the ethics in cyberspaces, right? I know we have a number of people, especially on Twitter, who are doing good work that I have seen, and they they might be able to help come up with policies around social media on what it is supposed to look like when this is our professional space, but still sometimes our personal space, because those overlap. We are not therapists 24/7, but we also can't turn off the fact that we're therapists. Feel free to jump in. That was my whole thing. I think I missed a point, but I said it and it's done now.
I wanted to kind of echo one of the last points that you just made about while we are therapists, we are people, right? And one thought that I had as a student, first being introduced to CSNET, I will be honest, I felt like I was watching counselors behave badly. And I think there is an expectation that if you're in this particular field, that there's certain ways that you engage and that you adhere to the ethical codes, and that transcends not only when you have your therapist hat on, but also when you're out and about, because they have that saying even about, I think it's like about integrity. It's what you do when people aren't watching. And with CSNET being such an open forum and accessible to everyone, we have such an obligation as counselor educators to engage in a way that adheres to our ethical codes, as well as demonstrates to counseling students and counselor educators alike that this is a space that we utilize professionally and engage appropriately with all folks. And so I think there's a lot of work that can be done around how we engage in these spaces, as well as I loved some of the discussion around that accountability piece, and really being maybe even an ally for folks when we see this bad behavior going on. I see that there are also some questions in the chat, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself. So I will pause there for now.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. All I was going to do was just chime in when, we're finding out about individuals in our professional communities behaving badly. That's that time for us to go beyond the ally. And I think of Dr. Ford's work with being a co-conspirator. And so we can be co-conspirators to individuals who are being targeted, and then also applauding the positive content. So if you're working in the K through 12 setting, or you're in a counselor education and supervision program, applauding positive content and speaking out about it, bringing in information to support, changes in your curricula, exposing the hate speech for being dishonest, false, and hurtful. Because sometimes folks may have facts, and I think about the alternative facts, counterfacts, et cetera, but being able to set it straight so we can promote the values of respect and diversity. And I'm allowed Dr. Green to speak. I'm sorry about that, Dr. Green.
I was literally just going to wrap up, so I appreciate you chiming in there. And just to maybe, I guess I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I guess we can try to answer some questions that have maybe, or comments that have come up in the chat.
Also, if somebody is looking for the PowerPoint or anything, that we have put that in the chat, and it does have all of our sources. And there's also a QR code to get to Darius's report that he kindly put up on his website.
And if others have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute and yeah, go ahead.
So there's a question from Peggy around K-12 public schools, higher education, and how even in those spaces promoting diversity is clearly an issue when we're talking around race. And my assumption is also when then we have these profiles of individual people in all of those settings, and then also the schools promoting, what does that look like in cyberspace to be able to confront this attack on even promoting diversity within cyberspaces affecting K-12?
One thing that comes to mind of just briefly, I'll state that, like, I guess this, what it looks like varies across states, but cyber harassment, cyber bullying, they technically are illegal offenses. And so I feel like a lot of people doing this kind of justice-oriented work sometimes are a little bit timid about like acknowledging that and leveraging that, but that can definitely be a resource of collaborating with legal professionals to understand like what is like actions that can be taken on in a legal sense to get people to back off, and also to build their own social awareness that this is like socially unacceptable and also can come with repercussions. That can be one way to some relationships to possibly build and confidence to build.
I think that I've not had this. I think this really goes with what Dr. Green was saying, but I've never done it around any kind of like racial issue that's occurring. But I work with trans kids, and I frequently have to have conversations with school systems about their policies around names and pronouns. And one of the things that I like to be very upfront with them is what happens if you don't do this, right? So trans kids whose names are not used and pronouns are not respected have a much higher likelihood of like a mental health crisis and even an attempt at suicide. So letting them know that they are liable for the harm that they are causing and what that could mean, the consequences of it long-term for their students and their school district if you're working in that kind of area. I know that will not motivate everyone, but I found that frequently they take me more seriously when I point out to them that this isn't a matter of preference, this is a matter of life and death.
I'll definitely say this. As someone who has experienced racial microaggressions along with harassment in the workplace setting, definitely using the case of literature, like to transform the experience. So one of the things is being able to do scholarly presentations like this along with working on publications. That is something that can definitely be powerful, along with adding to the bodies of literature. So others are aware about some of these unimaginable workspaces we may be experiencing, and being able to think about how sometimes if you're in an environment that's not conducive for growth, how that may inhibit the ability to develop diversity-related strategic plans when you have restrictive power in action. So we have to be able to work on is utilizing our voices and or creating our counter narratives.
I also just want to acknowledge, Katrina, the comment that you wrote in the chat, your last remark of wanting to write an article about your experience, I think aligns well with what Dr. Varnado-Johnson just shared, and just emphasizing the importance of really highlighting and sharing these stories and putting it out there when it happens so that we can really start to move that needle forward for progression and change.
I'll also just briefly chime in. That could be like a really nice healing process for ourselves internally. And also I want to say that, like, feel free to not do that on behalf of other people if that is not sort of aligned with your own healing process. I just kind of wanted to state that because I know racial healing being a big focus, sometimes people can myself included, will feel compelled to like act on behalf of the collective, or to advocate for issues and spaces that honestly don't care about people like me, or people who have similar experiences to me. And so I just kind of want to throw that out there as well.